The dirt on my grandfather's grave wasn't even settled yet, but inside his Key West estate, the calculator in my father's head was already clicking. I stood in the corner of the living room gripping a damp handkerchief. My name is Meredith. I'm 28 years old and I was the only person in the room actually mourning. The ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, cutting through the thick, humid air, but the tension down here was suffocating. My parents weren't crying. They were working. I watched as my father ran his knuckles across the antique mahogany dining table, listening to the sound of the wood like he was testing a ripe melon. Solid, he muttered, not to me, but to the air. Mid-century. Worth at least $5,000. Across the room, my mother was busy flipping over a porcelain vase to check the hallmark on the bottom. They weren't looking at memories. They were looking at inventory. They say funerals bring families together, but honestly, I think they just bring out the vultures. I'm really curious, where are you watching this from today? And have you ever seen a relative's grief turn instantly into greed the moment a will is mentioned? Let me know your story in the comments below. I looked back at them. The audacity was almost impressive. It made me think of the last conversation I had with Grandpa Arthur right on this porch 3 months ago. He didn't give me a sentimental speech about love or family. He had grabbed my wrist, his eyes sharp and lucid for the first time in weeks, and whispered a warning I didn't understand at the time. Meredith, he had rasped, if you ever have to choose between blood and ink, trust the ink. Paper doesn't lie, people do. I was just starting to realize exactly what he meant. My father suddenly stopped tapping the furniture and walked toward me. He didn't offer a hug. He didn't ask if I was okay. He looked right through me, his eyes scanning the walls behind my head. Meredith, he said, his voice flat and authoritative. Start packing up the old man's junk tomorrow morning. Clear everything out. Your mother and I need this space empty. We have to start making calculations for the future of this house. He didn't say, our house. He said, this house. And just like that, the mourning period was over. The invasion had begun. I wasn't woken by the usual cry of seagulls or the gentle lap of the tide against the seawall. Instead, the abrasive rhythmic dragging of plastic wheels rolling over antique heart pine floors pulled me from my sleep. I threw on a robe and stepped into the hallway, my heart sinking as the noise grew louder. It was coming from the master suite, Grandpa Arthur's sanctuary. The door, which I had reverently closed yesterday after the funeral, was now flung wide open. Inside, the air, usually scented with cedar and old tobacco, was now choked with the heavy perfume my mother favored. Richard and Susan hadn't returned to their hotel. They were moving in. Richard, be careful with that vanity, it looks fragile. My mother directed, pointing a manicured finger at the dresser, while my father shoved a heavy leather suitcase onto the bed. The bed was still unmade. Grandpa's sheets were still there. What are you doing? I asked, my voice tight. Grandpa's things are still in here. My mother didn't even look at me. She was standing by the closet, pulling out Grandpa's dress whites, his pristine navy uniform that he had kept sealed in plastic for 30 years. With a careless flick of her wrist, she tossed the uniform onto the dusty floor to make room for her collection of floral sundresses. We need the space. Meredith, she said, smoothing out a silk blouse. Besides, this room has the best view of the ocean. Your father is the head of the household now. It's only fitting he sleeps in the master suite. I looked at the uniform crumpled on the floor like a pile of rags. I wanted to scream, to snatch it up and demand they leave, but I knew it was useless. They had already planted their flag. I quietly walked over, picked up the uniform, and folded it over my arm. They didn't even notice me leaving. The midday peace was shattered 2 hours later by the aggressive roar of a turbocharged engine. I looked out the kitchen window just in time to see a flash of cherry red paint. A low-slung sports car drifted into the gravel driveway, tires spinning unnecessarily fast, kicking up a cloud of dust. The driver didn't aim for the open space near the garage. Instead, He swerved onto the grass, the heavy tires crushing a row of rare dendrobium orchids that Grandpa had spent the last decade cultivating. The engine cut, and out stepped Kevin. My brother, 24 years old and looking like he had just stepped out of a Miami nightclub, adjusted his aviator sunglasses. He held his phone up immediately, panning the camera across the facade of the house, talking animatedly to an invisible audience of followers. "Finally made it to the Legacy Estate, guys. Sorry for the radio silence," I heard him say as he walked toward the porch, stepping right over the crushed purple petals of the orchids without a downward glance. I met him at the door. "You missed the funeral, Kevin. Flight got delayed. Nightmare," he said, pushing past me without a hug or a handshake. He smelled of stale energy drinks and expensive cologne. "Besides, Mom said you handled everything. I'm here now, right? Needed to get out of the city anyway. Too much heat. Too many people asking for money." He didn't mention Grandpa. He didn't ask how I was. He dropped a duffel bag on the hallway table, scratching the wood. "I'm gonna crash here for a few weeks. Clear my head. Where's the Wi-Fi password?" By evening, the transformation of the house was horrifyingly swift. The dignified silence of the library where Grandpa used to read nautical charts was replaced by the chaotic noise of digital gunfire. I stood in the doorway of the study. Kevin had pushed the heavy oak desk against the wall. A tangle of black cables snaked across the floor like vines. He was standing on a chair, a power drill in his hand, driving a massive screw directly into the plaster wall to mount a curved gaming monitor. Dust from the plaster coated the spines of the leather-bound books below. "Kevin, stop!" I rushed forward. "You can't drill into that wall. That's original lathe and plaster, it'll crack. And there are structural beams back there." The drill whirred loudly, drowning me out for a second before he released the trigger. He looked down at me, annoyed, blowing dust off the drill bit. "Chill out, Meredith. You're acting like this place is a museum," he sneered, stepping down from the chair. He kicked an empty beer can under the desk. "Why do you care about a hole in the wall? Dad's gonna flip this place to some developer in a month anyway. They're gonna bulldoze it and build a resort or something. Who cares if the wall cracks?" He turned his back on me and revved the drill again. "I need my setup. Go find something useful to do." I stood there trembling as the drill bit into the wall again. The sound felt like it was boring into my own skull. Kevin's words echoed in the small room. Bulldoze it. To them, this wasn't a home. It wasn't a heritage. It was just a pile of wood and brick standing between them and a payout. And they were already tearing it apart to get to the gold. That evening, the dining room felt less like a place for a family meal and more like a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided in the judge's chambers. The atmosphere was brittle, snapping with an electric tension that made the air conditioner's hum feel deafening. Richard had raided Grandpa's wine cellar, unearthing a 1998 Cabernet that Arthur had been saving for a wedding anniversary that never came. My father poured the dark red liquid into crystal goblets with a flourish, filling them too high, acting the part of the lord of the manor. He didn't propose a toast to the deceased. Instead, he slapped a thick, glossy folder onto the center of the mahogany table, right next to the platter of expensive sashimi they had ordered. "I've run the comps," Richard announced, his voice booming with unearned confidence. He tapped the folder with a heavy index finger. "The Key West market is aggressive right now. Inventory is low, demand is high. A property with this kind of ocean frontage. If we list aggressive, we're looking at 2.5 million. Cash." He let the number hang in the air like a prayer. 2.5 million. Kevin, who was slouching in his chair and texting under the table, finally looked up. A slow, greedy grin spread across his face, the blue light of his phone reflecting in his eyes. He picked up a piece of tuna with his chopsticks, chewing loudly. 2.5, Kevin asked, his mouth full. "That's decent. That works." "It's more than decent, sweetheart. It's a new beginning," my mother Susan chimed in. She reached over and squeezed Kevin's hand, her eyes shining with a manic intensity. "This is exactly the seed capital you need for your tech startup." I nearly choked on my water. Startup. We all knew the truth. Kevin didn't have a business plan. He had a gambling addiction disguised as cryptocurrency investment, and a string of maxed-out credit cards. The investors he talked about were likely loan sharks in Miami or angry bookies. But in this house, the lie was currency. "Wait," I said, my voice cutting through their celebration. "You're talking about selling the house to fund Kevin's business. This estate has been in the family for 3 generations. Grandpa explicitly said he wanted it kept as a gathering place." My mother set her wine glass down hard, the crystal chiming dangerously against the wood. "Grandpa is dead. Meredith." Susan said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The living people matter now. Your brother has potential. He has a future. What are we supposed to do? Let $2 million sit here rotting in the salt air just so you can play librarian in a mausoleum?" "It's about asset liquidation," Richard added, using business buzzwords to mask his own desperation. I knew his real estate developments in Orlando had gone belly up last year. He needed this sale just as badly as Kevin did. "We sell, we take the equity, we divide it. We'll give you a nice cut, Meredith. Maybe 50,000. You can finally move out of that carriage house, get a condo in town, find a husband." Then came the hammer drop. Richard leaned forward, his face hardening. "Speaking of the carriage house, we need you out." I froze. "What?" "2 weeks." Richard said, holding up 2 fingers. "The realtor says the guest cottage adds significant value if it's staged as a rental unit or an Airbnb. We need to gut it, repaint it, and stage it. We can't have you living there with your clutter when the photographers come." "You're evicting me?" I asked, my grip tightening on my silver fork until my knuckles turned white. "I've lived in the carriage house for 5 years. I took care of Grandpa while you two were busy in Atlanta." "We're not evicting you," Susan said dismissively, waving a hand as if swatting away a fly. "We're asking you to support the family. Don't be so selfish, Meredith. You're the oldest. You should be happy to sacrifice a little comfort so your brother can have a launch pad. God, you're always so dramatic." I looked at them. Really looked at them. Kevin was smirking already, spending the money in his head, probably browsing listings for Lamborghinis on his phone under the table. Richard was pouring himself more of the stolen wine, his eyes glassy with greed. Susan was looking at me with pure disdain, as if my very presence was an obstacle to her lifestyle. I opened my mouth to scream. I wanted to flip the table. I wanted to shout that I paid the property taxes last year when Richard forgot. I wanted to tell them that Grandpa hated Kevin's laziness and Richard's arrogance. But then I saw the cold calculation in my father's eyes. If I fought them now, if I told them I wouldn't leave, they would dig. They would look for papers. They might find the file in the safe before Mr. Sterling could execute the legal maneuver. Or worse, they might destroy physical evidence if they realized they had no claim. To trap a predator, you have to play dead. The fight drained out of my posture intentionally. I slumped my shoulders. I let my eyes drop to the tablecloth, feigning defeat. I needed them to think I was weak. I needed them to think they had won so completely that they wouldn't bother checking the perimeter. "I understand," I said softly, forcing a tremor into my voice. The tension in the room snapped, replaced instantly by triumphant relief. "Good girl," Richard said, taking a large swig of wine. "I knew you'd see reason. We'll hire a moving truck for you. Put it on the tab to be paid at closing." 2 weeks, Meredith," my mother reminded me, picking up her chopsticks again. "And try to clean the place up before you go. We want top dollar." I nodded, taking a sip of my water to hide the cold, hard smile that was threatening to form on my lips. "Yes," I thought. "You'll get exactly what you deserve." The scent of cheap latex paint became the new perfume of my grandfather's home, masking the salt air and the lingering notes of cedar. It started with a white van pulling up to the curb, spilling out a crew of contractors who looked like they were being paid by the hour to work as fast and carelessly as possible. Richard stood in the foyer, barking orders like a foreman, pointing at the hand-carved mahogany wainscoting that had lined the hallway for 90 years. "Brighten it up," my father commanded, waving his hand dismissively at the dark, rich wood. "It's too gloomy. Buyers want light. Buyers want modern. Paint it all. Swiss coffee white." I stood at the top of the stairs, watching in horror as a roller slathered thick white primer over the intricate grain of the wood. It felt like watching someone suffocate a living thing. They didn't sand it. They didn't prep it. They just erased it. In the library, the destruction was even more personal. Susan was overseeing the decluttering process. She had a box of heavy-duty black trash bags at her feet. She wasn't sorting. She was purging. I watched her pull down a stack of leather-bound nautical logs, Grandpa Arthur's handwritten records from his time in the Navy, detailing every storm he'd weathered and every port he'd visited. "Dust collectors," Susan muttered, dropping the heavy books into a garbage bag with a sickening thud. Next went the rolled-up navigational charts of the Florida Straits, yellowed with age and marked with Arthur's pencil notes. "Nobody uses paper maps anymore, Richard. It's all GPS. This is just bad feng shui. Get rid of it." "Mom, those are historical documents," I protested, stepping into the room. "The Maritime Museum would take those." "We don't have time to curate a museum exhibit, Meredith," she snapped, tying off the bag. "The junk haulers are coming at 5. If you want this trash, you can dig it out of the dumpster yourself. But don't bring it back inside." That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, that is exactly what I did. I waited until the house was dark, until the snoring from the master bedroom signaled that the invaders were asleep. I crept out to the large construction dumpster they had parked on the lawn. It smelled of wet paint and sawdust. I climbed in my flashlight, cutting through the gloom, frantically tearing open bags to rescue what I could. I found the logs. I found the charts. But at the bottom of a bucket filled with dried paint chips and stripped screws, I found something that made my breath catch in my throat. It was Grandpa's compass. It was a heavy brass instrument encased in a wooden box that had sat on his desk for as long as I could remember. He used to tell me it was the one thing that always told him the truth, no matter how thick the fog was. Now, it lay in the trash. The glass face was shattered, likely from being tossed carelessly into the bin. The delicate needle, which had pointed north for 40 years, was bent at a jagged angle, stuck pointing nowhere. I picked it up, wiping a smear of white primer off the brass casing. I sat there in the dumpster, surrounded by the discarded remnants of my grandfather's life, and felt a tear, hot and angry, slide down my cheek. It landed on the broken glass. This wasn't just carelessness. This was a rejection of everything Arthur stood for. Honor, direction, history, all of it broken and thrown away to make room for a quick sale. "Hey guys, check this out." A sudden burst of light blinded me. I looked up, squinting against the harsh glare of an LED ring light. Kevin was standing on the porch, phone in hand, filming. He wasn't filming the stars. He was filming me. "That's my sister," Kevin narrated to his live stream, zooming in. "Literal trash panda, digging in the dumpster at 2 a.m. I told you guys, some people just don't have the mindset for wealth. They cling to the past. We're about that future, right?" He laughed, a hollow, performative sound meant for his audience. "Hit that like button if you think we should bulldoze the carriage house next and put in an infinity pool." I didn't hide. I didn't climb out. I stayed right there, clutching the broken compass to my chest, staring directly into his camera lens. "Keep filming, Kevin." I thought, my grief hardening into cold resolve. "Document everything. Show the world exactly who you are. Because when the judge sees this, there won't be any doubt left." I wiped the tear from the compass face. The needle was broken, but I knew exactly where I was going. The morning sun didn't bring warmth. it brought strangers. By 9 a.m., a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb, and out stepped Linda, a local realtor who had been my mother's sorority sister 30 years ago. She was wearing a blazer that was too bright for a house of mourning and carrying a sign that looked like a tombstone for my childhood. I watched from the carriage house window as Linda and my father hammered the for sale sign into the front lawn, right next to the trampled orchid bed. The thud 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 of the mallet felt like a gavel banging in a courtroom. By noon, the first potential buyers arrived. They were a young couple from New York looking for a vacation home. My parents put on a performance worthy of an Oscar. Susan offered them iced tea in Grandpa's crystal glasses, laughing a little too loudly at their jokes. Richard guided them through the freshly painted hallways, pointing out the renovations, as if he hadn't just slapped a coat of cheap white paint over history. I tried to stay invisible, but Richard cornered me in the kitchen while the buyers were inspecting the pool. He wasn't smiling anymore. "Here," he said, sliding a single sheet of paper across the granite island. I looked down. It was a document titled Waiver of Tenancy and Occupancy Rights. "What is this?" I asked, though I knew exactly what it was. "It's standard procedure." Richard lied smoothly, checking his watch. "Since you've been squatting in the carriage house for a few years, the title company just needs you to sign this confirming you have no claim to the property. It clears the way for a clean closing." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Look, Meredith, I know we've been hard on you, but once this deal closes, I'm going to cut you a check for $50,000. You can buy a new car, get a fresh start. Just sign the paper." $50,000. That was the price he put on my complicity. He thought he could buy my silence with a fraction of what the house was worth, all while calling my caretaking squatting. My hand hovered over the paper, my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. If I signed this, I might complicate Mr. Sterling's plan. If I refused outright, they might kick me out physically before the trap could snap shut. I needed to buy time. I can't sign this right now," I stammered, backing away. "The legal language is confusing. I need to read it over. My friend is a paralegal. She told me never to sign anything without reading the fine print." Richard's face darkened instantly. The benevolent father mask slipped, revealing the desperate debtor underneath. "You don't need a paralegal, Meredith. You need to do what you're told," he hissed. "These buyers are serious. They want a quick close." "I'll sign it tomorrow," I promised, clutching the paper to my chest. "I just need one night to review it. Please, Dad, I don't want to make a mistake." He glared at me, his jaw working. Then he heard the buyers coming back from the pool. He forced a tight, fake smile. "Fine," he whispered harshly. "One day. Tomorrow night we're hosting a cocktail party for the buyers and some local investors. A soft opening for the sale. You will sign this paper in front of everyone. No more excuses. Do you understand?" "I understand," I whispered. I fled to the carriage house and locked the door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial the phone. "Hello." The voice on the other end was deep and calm. "Mr. Sterling." I breathed into the receiver, sliding down to sit on the floor. "It's happening. They put up the sign. They have buyers. And they're trying to make me sign a waiver of tenancy." There was a pause on the line, then a low, grim chuckle. "Of course they are," Arthur's old lawyer said. "They're trying to scrub the title because they know deep down that something is wrong. Did you sign it?" "No. I bought us 24 hours. They're having a party tomorrow night to finalize the deal." "Perfect," Mr. Sterling said. The words sounded like a heavy book closing. "Let them have their party. Let them gather an audience. I have the files ready. The life estate deed, the original trust documents, and the foreclosure notices on your father's Orlando properties. I'll see you tomorrow night, Meredith. Wear something nice. It's going to be a memorable evening." I hung up the phone and looked out the window at the for sale sign casting a long shadow over the lawn. The storm wasn't coming anymore. It was here. And tomorrow, lightning was going to strike. The garden had been transformed into a stage set for a play about a happy, wealthy family. Strings of Edison bulbs were draped between the palm trees, casting a warm golden glow over the manicured lawn. A jazz quartet played softly in the corner, competing with the rhythmic crash of the waves. Waiters circulated with silver trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, weaving through a crowd of about 30 people, local investors, the eager buyers from New York, and a handful of Richard's old business contacts he was trying desperately to impress. I stood on the periphery near the bougainvillea trellis, wearing a simple black dress, watching the performance. Richard looked the part of the patriarch perfectly. He was holding court near the pool, a cigar in one hand and a scotch in the other, laughing uproariously at a joke made by the potential buyer. Susan was gliding between groups, her laughter tinkling like broken glass, playing the role of the gracious hostess in a home she deemed too old-fashioned just yesterday. And Kevin, he was the star of his own show. He had cornered a local banker near the bar, showing him photos on his phone. "Yeah, the McLaren 720S. I heard Kevin say, his voice carrying over the music. "I'm putting the deposit down next week. We're closing a major real estate deal. Family assets, you know how it is. Liquidating to diversify into tech." The banker nodded politely, but I saw him glance at Kevin's scuffed sneakers. He knew. They all knew something was off, but the free champagne kept them polite. "Meredith." Richard's voice boomed across the patio, silencing the jazz band for a split second. He waved me over with a wide, predatory grin. "Come here, sweetheart. Come join us." The crowd parted. I felt every eye on me as I walked across the stone pavers. This was the moment. He wanted a public execution of my rights. He wanted witnesses so I couldn't back out. Richard threw a heavy arm around my shoulders. It felt like a yoke. "Everyone, this is my daughter Meredith," he announced, beaming. "She's been holding down the fort here for years, a real caretaker. And tonight, she's helping us take the next step." He signaled to Linda, the realtor, who stepped forward with a clipboard and a heavy fountain pen. The waiver of tenancy document was clipped to the front, stark and white. "Just a little formality so these nice folks can close on their dream home," Richard said, his voice dropping to a low, threatening murmur that only I could hear. "Sign it. Now." He held the pen out to me. The gold nib glinted under the string lights. I took the pen. It felt cold and heavy. The silence in the garden grew thick. The buyers were watching expectantly. Susan was gripping her pearl necklace, her knuckles white. Kevin paused his conversation, watching me with a smug sneer. I looked at the paper. Then I looked up at Richard. I didn't uncap the pen. "You want me to sign this so you can sell the house?" I said, my voice clear and steady, carrying through the humid night air. "It's just paperwork, honey," Susan chirped from the side, stepping closer. "Don't bore the guests." "I have a question first," I said, ignoring her. I turned my body so I was facing Richard, directly blocking out the crowd. "You said this sale is to secure the family's future, specifically to fund Kevin's startup. Is that correct?" Richard's smile faltered, twitching at the corners. "We discussed this at dinner, Meredith." "Yes. Now sign." "Okay." I nodded slowly. "And you are selling this house because, as the only son, you believe you inherited it from Grandpa Arthur." "Right." "I am the owner." Richard snapped, his patience fraying. "Stop playing games." "Then why?" I asked, my voice dropping an octave, becoming ice cold. "In the last 20 years, have you never paid a single dollar of property tax on this estate?" A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. The banker near the bar set his drink down. Richard's face flushed a deep, ugly red. "That's administrative. I handle the big picture." "And why?" I pressed on, stepping closer, forcing him to take a step back. "Are all the permits for the roof, repair, the seawall reinforcement, and the electrical rewiring in my name?" If this is your house, Dad, why didn't you know the roof was leaking in 2018? Why didn't you know the foundation was cracking in 2020? Shut up! Susan shrieked, abandoning her hostess persona entirely. She lunged forward, grabbing my arm. You ungrateful little brat. You're just the maid. You lived here for free while we paid for everything. You paid for nothing, I shouted back, shaking her off. The jazz band had stopped playing completely. The guests were staring, drinks forgotten in their hands. I turned back to Richard. He was breathing heavily, his fists clenched, looking like he wanted to strike me but holding back only because of the audience. You want to sell this place to pay off Kevin's gambling debts, I said, exposing the lie they had told everyone. Kevin's face went pale in the background. You invited these people here to celebrate a robbery. This is my house, Richard roared, losing all control. I am Arthur's son, I am the heir, you are nothing. I looked at him with profound pity. I lifted the heavy fountain pen and let it drop. Clang. It hit the glass table with a sharp, jarring sound that echoed like a gunshot in the silent garden. You want to sell my house to pay for your golden boy's debts? I said, a small, cold smile touching my lips. But tell me, Richard, in what capacity are you speaking? What? Richard blinked, confused by the sudden shift in my tone. You are speaking as if you own this property, I said softly. But you don't. Before he could respond, a metallic screech cut through the air. Everyone turned toward the driveway. The heavy wrought iron gates, which Richard had locked to keep the riffraff out, were swinging open. A black sedan rolled through, followed closely by a police cruiser with its lights flashing silently. Mr. Sterling stepped out of the back of the sedan. He was wearing a tuxedo, impeccable and sharp, holding a thick leather portfolio. He walked onto the patio, flanked by 2 uniformed officers and a private security detail. Good evening, Mr. Sterling said, his voice projecting effortless authority. He didn't look at Richard. He looked straight at me and bowed his head slightly. I apologize for the interruption, Ms. Meredith, but I believe there are some trespassers on your property who need to be removed. The silence that followed Mr. Sterling's announcement was heavier than the humid Florida air. It was the silence of a guillotine blade hanging at the top of its arc. Richard blinked, his face draining of color until it matched the white paint he had slathered on the walls. Trespassers, he sputtered, trying to maintain his bravado but failing miserably. Now, look here, Sterling. I know you were my father's lawyer, but you can't just barge in here and threaten the rightful heir. Mr. Sterling didn't argue. He simply walked to the glass table, moving the discarded fountain pen aside with a grimace of distaste, and laid his leather portfolio open. There is no heir to this property, Richard, because this property was never part of Arthur's estate at the time of his death. Sterling said, his voice projecting clearly to the back of the garden. 5 years ago, Arthur executed a life estate deed. He transferred the title of this home to Meredith, immediately retaining only the right to live here until his passing. Upon his death 3 days ago, full ownership vested instantly and automatically in Meredith. No probate, no inheritance, no you. He pulled out a document with a raised seal and held it up. This is the deed. Recorded, notarized, and unassailable. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. The investor from New York, the one Richard had been courting all night, surged forward. He was a large man, and he looked ready to tear my father apart. You took my $50,000 deposit this morning? He roared, grabbing Richard by the lapel of his expensive tuxedo. You sold me a house you don't even own. That's fraud. Richard stammered, his hands shaking as he tried to pry the man's fingers off. It's a misunderstanding. I thought the will— There is no will, Sterling cut in sharply. There is only the deed. But the money. Susan shrieked, her facade of the wealthy matriarch shattering completely. She looked wild, her eyes darting between the angry buyer and the police officers. We need that money. I already spent it. The confession hung in the air, ugly and raw. You spent it. Richard turned to his wife, his eyes bulging. "Susan, you said you put it in the escrow account. I paid off the Amex." She wailed, collapsing into a chair, sobbing not for forgiveness but for herself. "They were going to sue us. I thought we'd get the rest of the millions next week. Meredith, you can't do this to us. We're your parents." I watched them. My father being shaken by a defrauded buyer, my mother wailing about credit card debt, and I felt nothing. No pity, no anger, just a cold, clean detachment. "Where's Kevin?" I asked suddenly. I looked around. The tech entrepreneur was nowhere to be seen. "He went for the gate," a security guard shouted. We all turned to see Kevin sprinting across the lawn toward the driveway, trying to reach the open gate before the police could close it. He was fumbling with his car keys, desperate to flee the scene before the questions about his startup turned into questions about wire fraud. 2 officers intercepted him before he even reached the pavement. They grabbed him by the arms, and I saw the distinct flash of handcuffs. "Let me go. My dad owns this place." Kevin screamed, kicking at the officers like a petulant child. "Check the will. Check the will. Take them off the property," I said to Mr. Sterling. My voice was quiet, but in the sudden hush of the garden everyone heard it. "All of them?" Sterling asked. "All of them," I confirmed. "They are trespassing." The eviction was swift and humiliating. The police escorted the angry buyer away, promising him a statement for his fraud lawsuit. Then they turned to Richard and Susan. My father tried to retain some dignity, straightening his jacket, but the illusion was gone. He was just a con man in a borrowed suit. "You can't do this," Richard hissed as the officers guided him toward the gate. "We have clothes inside. We have valuables." "You have nothing inside," I corrected him, standing on the steps of the carriage house. "Everything inside belongs to the homeowner. You can contact Mr. Sterling's office to arrange a time to pick up your personal effects, under police supervision." They were marched out of the gate past the "for sale" sign they had planted with such arrogance only yesterday. Susan was still sobbing, her heels clicking unevenly on the asphalt. Kevin was shoved into the back of a squad car. The heavy iron gates swung shut with a final resonant clang, locking them out. I stood alone in the garden. The party guests had fled like cockroaches when the lights turned on. The jazz band was packing up in awkward silence. The storm that had been brewing for days finally broke. A crack of thunder shook the ground, and the rain began to fall, a heavy, cleansing tropical downpour that washed the spilled champagne from the patio stones and soaked into the earth where the orchids used to be. The salt air in Key West does something remarkable to old wood. If you treat it right, it heals. I stood on the veranda, running my hand along the newly restored railing. The cheap, suffocating white paint was gone, stripped away by weeks of careful sanding to reveal the warm, honey-colored heart pine underneath. The house breathed again. It had been exactly 1 year since the gate slammed shut on my family. The silence here was different now. It wasn't the heavy-loaded silence of a funeral, nor the tense silence of a battlefield. It was a clean silence filled only by the rustle of palm fronds and the distant chime of a buoy bell. I walked back into the library. The holes Kevin had drilled into the plaster had been patched and painted invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. The shelves were full again, not with Grandpa's original logs, which were gone forever, but with new books I had started collecting. Histories of the Florida Keys, guides to marine biology, my own story filling the empty spaces. I picked up the brass compass from the desk. I had thought about sending it to a restoration specialist in Miami. I could have had the glass replaced, the needle straightened, the brass polished until it looked new. But in the end, I decided against it. I hung it on the wall right above Grandpa's old desk. The glass was still cracked in a spiderweb pattern. The needle was still bent, frozen in a permanent deviation. It wasn't a tool for navigation anymore. It was a monument. A reminder that sometimes you have to break to find out what you're made of. Ring! The shrill sound of the landline phone cut through the afternoon peace. I looked at the caller ID. The area code was from a low-rent district on the mainland just outside of Miami. I knew who it was. Mr. Sterling kept me updated, though I never asked him to. He told me that Richard and Susan had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy 3 months ago. The lawsuit from the New York buyer had drained their remaining liquid assets, and the bank had foreclosed on their Orlando condo. They were living in a small 2-bedroom apartment near the airport now. Richard was trying to sell timeshares, Susan was working retail, and Kevin, the tech mogul, was currently washing dishes at a seafood shack in Marathon Key, part of his probation agreement to avoid jail time for the wire fraud charges. Rang. The phone persisted. It was probably Susan calling to guilt-trip me, or Richard calling to bluster about how ungrateful I was while asking for a loan. They still didn't get it. They thought this was a negotiation. They thought we were still playing a game where they could maneuver me into submission. I didn't pick up the receiver. I reached behind the antique side table, found the phone jack, and gently pulled the cord from the wall. The ringing stopped instantly. I looked up at the broken compass. "The needle might be bent, Grandpa," I whispered to the quiet room. "But my direction has never been clearer." I picked up my glass of iced tea and walked out onto the porch, sitting in the rocking chair that used to be his. I looked out at the ocean, vast and indifferent and beautiful. The horizon was a straight, unbroken line. I was alone. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't lonely. I was free. Conclusion and moral. This story isn't just about a house or a will. It's a harsh reminder of a reality many of us face, but are afraid to admit. Sometimes the most toxic people in your life are the ones who share your DNA. Meredith's journey teaches us a valuable lesson about boundaries. We are often raised to believe that family is everything, and that we must forgive family members no matter how much they hurt us. But Richard and Susan proved that for some people, family is just another asset to be liquidated. They didn't see Meredith as a daughter. They seen her as an obstacle to their payday. The most powerful moment wasn't when Meredith got the house. It was when she pulled the phone cord from the wall. That act symbolized the ultimate freedom, not just financial freedom, but emotional freedom. She chose peace over duty. She chose truth over keeping the peace. So I want to ask you, at what point do you draw the line? Is there a price tag on your dignity? If you were in Meredith's shoes, would you have picked up that phone one last time, or would you have pulled the plug just like she did? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, sometimes you have to let go of the people who weigh you down so you can finally rise. Thanks for watching.